Welcome to the Affirming Village Podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Welcome back to the Affirming Village Podcast. I'm Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD therapist, advocate, and mom of 2 neurodivergent learners.
And I'm Lisa, here to talk all things neuroaffirming parenting, advocacy, and community.
In today's episode, we're diving into the power of parent input, how your voice shapes the IEP, shifts the language, and makes sure your learner story isn't reduced to data or behavior charts.
We'll share what meaningful parent input sounds like, how to write it in a neuroaffirming way, and why your perspective matters just as much as any experts in the room.
Because when parents speak from a place of understanding and affirmation, it doesn't just change the meeting, it changes the outcomes.
So let's get into it.
I always love our scripted beginning because if you're listening to this, we do a scripted beginning to let you guys know how the episode's going. And you can very much tell as you listen to our episodes that first part is scripted because it's so well put together and coordinated. And then you get into the episode and it's like chaos.
Yeah, I'm like, neither one of us talks like this, but that's okay. Thank you, ChatGPT. Thank you, ChatGPT. Destiny knows how to use that. I don't.
Hey, you got to use technology and make it work. So parent input. I think that even before I really understood like navigating IEPs and the special education process, I always felt, and I think this comes from being a woman, being Black, and then finding out I was also disabled. I think I always felt like my input mattered. I always felt like it was important for parents to talk about what they're doing, how they're trying to support their learner that also supports their peers, that also supports the staff at the school. And so I am very big on making sure that parents are communicating what they are doing so that question doesn't get asked what they're doing. And I was just wondering, like, Lisa, was it like that for you when you were navigating this journey as a parent? Like, did you ever feel like you had to prove, so to speak, like what you were doing? Or did you not feel like you were receiving those kind of statements or attacks because you were a teacher?
I honestly just very rarely, I don't want to say never, I very rarely felt listened to. And so I definitely never formally provided input ahead of time, but I feel like the dynamic that would unfold was multifold. One, I don't know how to stop talking. And my husband is much more like comfortable observing and like just sort of speaking intermittently, but like just sort of sitting back and letting me talk too much. But I felt like lots of things were happening. I definitely did not feel like there was a sense of safety in the room, really, like that I was an educator also, and that I was trying to form, in part, a collegial relationship, like a team relationship. But I also really, really felt like my daughter wasn't being seen. And so I feel like I kind of overshared to the point where I think I just sort of turned into Charlie Brown's teacher, like, wah, 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 right? Like, I don't think anybody was actually listening. And I was desperately trying to humanize her by like oversharing. And then I don't feel like that ever really translated into a document that captured her as a learner, as a human well. I mean, I'm sure, you know, it was long enough ago, and honestly, I've probably blocked some of the trauma out, but I'm sure there were pockets and moments of time. But I feel like in reflecting back, my overarching sort of pain point was that I just didn't feel heard. And then I would wonder, like, if as you know, a former educator and a white woman whose husband was always coming to the meetings and like with this sort of level of privilege, if I don't feel heard, what about somebody that doesn't have all of those things that they can say about themselves entering the space?
No, 100%. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to co host this with you, because you recognize and acknowledge the things and say the things out loud that are hard to say. That intersectionality piece is so important. And I always like to make sure I give credit to Maria Davis Pierre, founder of Autism in Black, because she's the one that introduced that term to me when I entered into the advocacy space. But, you know, looking at all those different components and layers that, you know, come in the room, whether you choose to or not. But, you know, gearing back to that parent input piece, you know, I think you're 100% correct. And I think that's why sometimes the parent input statement is not done ahead of time. And I think sometimes that's why it's only one or two sentences that are given to the staff when they ask you, what are your concerns, which is usually what that can boil down to. Because as parents, we are trying to humanize our learners. We are trying to make you understand that our disabled learner is not intentionally choosing to do or not do the things. We're trying to help you understand that there is nuance to this, that capacity matters, that, you know, environment matters, support being provided matters. And sometimes when dysregulated, because when I talk about my child, or I'm in a space where I have to feel like I have to defend my child, and that goes back to the IEP team setting, those involved, the collaboration, communication. But at the end of the day, it also comes back to the piece of like why we're meeting and what we're discussing. When I'm having to feel like I might have to defend why something was done and not excuse, because that's a big piece I feel like gets missed, is that you're making excuses. And it's like, no, I'm trying to help you understand why what happened happened. And to do that, we have to provide input and insight that you may not be privy to because you're not in our home, but also you may not have that relationship with that learner. And that really can drive the type of parent input and be necessary to go past those. I'm worried that they're struggling with reading. I'm worried about them making friends. I don't want them to get suspended anymore.
Right, right. Well, I think what can happen in the IEP process is that sort of gathering parent input is built into the procedure of the IEP, right? We ask for input while we're gathered around the table from different members about the learner's strengths. And then same thing, we ask for input from those gathered around the table for input around sort of concerns as they relate to education. And so I know for myself, and I don't know if you had this experience, it just felt performative, right? Like you show up and it's like, you know, what are her strengths? And you just feel like you vomit out the same thing every time. And then they ask what the concerns are, and you again vomit out the same thing. And for us, I can't remember if I shared this, where I shared this with you. But back in the day, like folks were handwriting stuff out. And we used to record our meetings. And so you could hear literally like the writing, you could hear the pencil scratching as everybody's oohing and gooing about how fantastic she is. And the second it hit concerns, there were less voices around the table expressing concerns. It was really driven by my husband and I, and like a lot of times staff wasn't contributing to that conversation because our daughter was so high masking. Um, but the pencils stopped. So they weren't really capturing it. And so to us, it was one of those things where it was like, do you have to ask me the same question every time because you're not really listening to the answer? And the answer is yes, they do, because it's part of the procedure
Mm-hmm.
of an IEP. But I think the piece that you and I want to lift up is that's less meaningful, and there are more meaningful ways to participate in this process ahead of the IEP meeting, so that piece of the meeting feels less performative.
100%. And I I'm so glad that you brought that up because yes, you and I have talked about that. And again, like Lisa and I are actually friends outside of this podcast. We've had many conversations, personally about our journeys. And it's very interesting because when you mention about the quietness on the concerns, I had the opposite.
Sure.
So, just for that context, Lisa Sayers high masking. And so any parent listening to this that has, and I was a high masker, any parent listening to this that has a high masker, you kind of feel like you're fighting to prove they need support. And it's everyone is not jumping until there's reactivity, until the shutdown has occurred, the burnout has occurred, the inability to make it to school has occurred, making it to school late has occurred.
Right.
I have the opposite side where my son, and I want to be clear, there's still that other side too, because my son, they were giving many strengths. So I want to be very clear about that. He's very smart, he's very intelligent, he's very helpful, he's very caring, like all the positives. But the other side of that was, again, he'd been in care since he was 6 weeks old, as far as like a structured setting around other peers. So he was a pretty good masker. It was the restriction and the sensory overload and overwhelm, that was the impact. And that started out with shutdown responses and dysregulation. And when he was essentially told that wasn't acceptable, and if you know me, I hate the word acceptable because it is subjective and it doesn't mean shit. Um, that he then began to have externalizing responses. And so that was always the point of concern. The concern was the jumping on the desk, hiding under the desk, throwing things, ripping up things.
Right.
And so when we would go to that point, I felt like we were already, before I even knew about neuroaffirming, and when I get asked about it, I'm like, actually, Lisa introduced me to neuroaffirming, and then I came across Kay Braun Johnson, who is an individual out of Canada who was at Autism in Black. She wrote an article, and that led me to Sunny Wise. So that's how I kind of went down my neuroaffirming path. And but when we would get asked about concerns, we were already looking back, reframing in a neuroaffirming way the concerns from what was being seen. Because my son too, and that's why I say there's different sides and levels to it, right? He also was not a injuring himself or others person either. He also wasn't struggling with that as a learner. It was very much like if you got in the way of something being thrown, you would be injured. But he was never, and they were very clear about that, thankfully. They were like, he's not intentionally trying to hit anyone, he's not intentionally throwing anything anyone, none of that. But it went from him internalizing to externalizing. And so because of that, I found myself as a mental health therapist who worked with children, trying to help them understand that these external dysregulated responses that they are seeing are not representative of him as a whole. They are a blip on a moment in time where he needs whatever he needs, because we didn't know at the time what he needed. We
Sure.
didn't know at the time what the trigger was. We didn't know at the time what the support would look like. But we just knew that was not our child. So we found ourselves like, hearing many concerns and then trying to help them understand that the concern was not fully representative of him, but also need to be framed at how do we support and not punish.
Yeah, so important. So important. So, you and I have shared a little bit about how we kind of initially got to know one another, that we were both part of kind of an ongoing mentorship. And that was the first time that I had heard about parent input. Was that also like sort of formalizing parent input in a parent input statement? Was that where you kind of learned that as well? Yeah, Destiny's
Yeah.
nodding for anybody that's not watching us.
Yeah, yeah, it was.
And so, there really is no one singular right way to provide parent input, but maybe it's helpful for us to sort of share how we conceptualize that and how we help families provide it. For me, it really is about wanting that piece of the IEP to have impact and be meaningful
Mhm.
and sort of increase um, the access for the parents to have meaningful participation in the IEP, right? So that we're actually able to kind of use it as a communication tool. This is what we're communicating about our learner to the team so that you have a better sense of who they are, and also the direction we want this IEP to go. Like, whether that's in terms of accommodations or areas for goals, this is what we're kind of envisioning for our learner in this plan that we're going to be creating together, instead of this performative of like, oh yeah, they're super sweet and kind, and I'm worried that they're not advocating for themselves well. Not that that isn't important, but like, it doesn't move the needle in the meeting itself. So for me, I created, and it's an ever evolving thing, but I created 9 questions that I send to families that cover everything from, who is your learner? What kind of temperament do they have? What kind of learner are they? Um, what are some sort of anecdotal um, stories you can share about things that bring them joy, things they're passionate about or interested in, like just a real sort of holistic, humanizing capture of them as a human being. I really want to capture communication and what that looks like for the learner, how that's sort of evolved over time. Are they a Gestalt language processor? Are they non-speaking? Are there motor differences that are impacting their access to communication? What types of tools and strategies are being employed, right? Are they a hand leader? Are they using sign? Like, what is it? And what's kind of the path that they've been on, and what kind of tools have we given them access to or tried? And then I really like to lean into regulation and what does engagement specifically look like for your young person, and what do the early tells of dysregulation look like, and what does it look like if we miss those early tells and your child becomes more escalated. And woven into that are what are the things that sort of sustain engagement and regulation, and what are some of the strategies and accommodations that they need to help when they're just starting to feel a little bit dysregulated, their nervous system's activated, and what strategies need to be implemented if those things either aren't successful or we miss those earlier cues. And then I usually round it out with some kind of a vision statement. And this varies from family to family. Some it's really specific to the upcoming year. Some it's more broad strokes, sort of ultimately I'm hoping, and some sort of blend the two. But I think you cover and capture some of that, maybe all of that, but you add other layers too. So how are you, like, what do you include and how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, so I love how you have the questions. I kind of do like a paragraph format similar to what, like the neuroaffirming course that you run where you would have the paragraphs. And I had, but what I make sure to focus on is their executive functioning, sensory supports, emotional regulation, and communication. Those are the pieces that I make sure are addressed throughout. And what I like to do if they're in the same school is I kind of have the parent identify, hey, this is what really worked. this is what went really well, and this is when it worked and went really well, and this is what I'd like to see improved on this year. This is what I'd like to focus on. And because I want to make sure that they like look at it and go, oh, I haven't updated this, I have them focus on that school year. What do you want this school year from whenever that annual is? Because I want them to be able to look back at the statement and see, okay, this is what happened second grade. Now we're in third grade, and this is what I want to happen. And so it allows them, and I think I do that because I'm autistic and ADHD. And so for me, when the way that I have my parents write their parent input statements is the exact way I write my own for my own children. And so I'm able to put in there and acknowledge the growth, the continued areas of concern, the new barriers. For example, my son's school, they're preparing them for changing classes before middle school, which I think is great.
Yeah.
I think that gives plenty of time, but it also is like now he's got to change classes. So I noted like we need to address the transition and how that impacts. So the parent input statements I have my parents do focuses on that. But another thing that you brought up that I want to bring up, that has that context is like when you were talking about like what does it look like when they're dysregulated, what does it look when they're starting to get dysregulated, right? What does it look like when we have gone past the part of that, preventative or proactive support? And what I come across is there's always this discussion and conversation with my Black and Brown families because there is this concern that if they're honest about what it looks like when the learner is dysregulated, that they're going to be labeled or they're going to attempt to place them elsewhere. And so we have to, again, and at this point, it's going to become a running joke through our podcast. We have to be very nuanced.
I knew you were going to say it, but it's so true. And I've had families, Black and Brown families, lift up very similar concerns. And I've honestly had white families lift up similar concerns when they've got a child that externalizes stress in ways that are typically described as aggressive or violent or right. Like, I mean, I had a family, obviously confidentiality maintained, in a conversation yesterday. It's a white family that the educator described their child as inappropriately violent. Right. Destiny's face is what my face did when I heard that.
Because what is appropriately violent? You see what I mean? Like being a literal person, like what is appropriately? Tell me what's appropriately violent. You can't.
Right.
That's
No,
great.
no. And just as a clarifying point, because I wasn't clear, I send questions out to parents, and then I use their answers to draft something that is in paragraph form.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what ultimately gets sent into the school is more of a narrative, no more than like a page and a half.
You are blurry.
I am blurry. I noticed it too. My camera does this. If you're watching this on YouTube, I apologize. It'll wake back up and realize that I'm here. And maybe it's better blurry. I think it actually looks better blurry. Can't see all the blemishes. Oh, she's coming back to life. No longer blurry. Sorry about that. Yeah, if I move too much, it's like the camera doesn't know what I'm doing.
That's hilarious.
And we all know I've got such good tech skills. I can't figure out what makes it happen or doesn't make it happen.
No, but it's very, it can be sometimes difficult too, I think, when you're doing parent input. Like, I think there's so many layers to one, being honest enough, going back to what you were mentioning about, like, I think sometimes we just essentially word vomit and we're like saying so many things and going on and like sometimes repeating ourselves. And it's because it's our child and we're so passionate about making you understand them and humanizing them and supporting them. And so we find ourselves like struggling with that aspect. I think the other side is, how much do I share? How much can I say? What makes me be looked at differently, or what makes it seem like I have so many families, again, because we are neuroaffirming, right? We're neuroaffirming advocates. and I'm sure you've encountered this, where you have families like the second that they say, I don't incorporate ABA. And I want to be clear when I preference this, we I always say, even as an autistic, you have to do what you have to do for your family. There's a lot of history there with ABA, and we're not going to get into that and dive into that. But a lot of times when a family does say that they don't use that, we know that that's very heavily rooted in schools. And so a
Sure.
lot of times what happens is the schools who have that old way, and that's why I say again, preferencing, we're not getting into the debate of old ABA, new ABA. Right now, maybe we'll at some point, but not today. But the schools immediately are like, well, that is the gold standard for autistic. And what I think is interesting is I was talking to somebody who was in the United Kingdom, and they were like, that is actually not the gold standard here for autism. They were like, we use child-led approaches. So I thought that was very interesting. I just want to point that out. Like I had a very interesting discussion with them. But it's like sometimes even just that coming from someone when you're trying to explain your approach and you're trying to explain how you parent your child and how you support your child can immediately make you feel like no matter what I say or write to go on this document, you're not going to understand or support my child. So I'm just going to nod and say that standard filler, that standard, they're sweet and caring, and I want them to make friends and do well. Because when they attack what you're saying in that way, you're kind of just like, okay, you're not even going to get why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that that's not. I get it. I totally get it, and it doesn't help kind of break the cycle of violence,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so then it becomes, well, what are the ways that I can frame what my overarching goals are, right? And so I really specifically do it where I talk about, I want my child to develop a sense of autonomy and agency and skills to advocate for themselves and a sense of self-determination. And some skills around regulation to kind of know themselves and what they need in terms of accommodating sensory differences. And so I kind of lay that out really plainly and state very plainly that a learner having a sense of who they are as a human being
Mm-hmm.
is so important in their growth and development as a human being, right? They're not going to stay 5 years old forever, right? And so this gets into a even broader conversation about the difference between independence and autonomy.
You were reading my mind, and I was like, we are definitely gonna have to do an episode on that because as soon as you said it, I was like, ooh, I love it because I always take when I see independence and make it autonomy,
Yeah, same.
and shift it. But yeah, that I mean, what you're talking about, that's 100% true, and I think that's a conversation I'm sure I know you have and that I have with the parents where sometimes parents come to us and they're just so tired and like beat down that they're just like, okay, I like, is it really going to matter? Is it really? And I'm like, it matters because it is a reflection of what you want for them, what you're saying for them, what they need, and that carries weight. The My son just said to me yesterday, my youngest, we are going to Urban Air, and we recently made some adjustments for him for his IEP, and he said, "You changed my schedule, mommy." He's like, changed my schedule. Right. And, this is something that was completely necessary. And like we had to do it. It's like get him the things that he needs and da 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 da. But what was funny was he goes, and really, if we wanted to change it back, you could just tell them. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, because when we talk to you about stuff, you talk to them about it, and then we get it figured out. And as a parent, I was just like, yes, like
Right.
you get what it is that I do. You feel heard. You recognize I take what you're saying and I put it out there. And so
That's right.
when we are talking about the parent input statement, that's why I'm so big on putting that information in there, because yes, that shapes your learner and how they look at your learner. But also the other side of it is that I have, as a parent, there's been times where I felt like I was fighting to prove that I'm doing everything I can. And I think that when you have to do that constantly, that's where you get to that documentation piece of like, I'm going to put this in black and white, and then you can't deny it. And so when you were talking about,
Right.
how you have them write their parent input and why, that's another why that I tell my families blatantly outright, is that that's why you say in there, like my sons, I put in there, we are working on socialization in a natural and comfortable way by having him do things he enjoy, by having him go to coding. We are working on regulation skills and self-advocacy skills by doing OT. I weave that in there because at the end of the day, you can't say you don't know what we're doing
Right.
because it's in there.
Yeah, that was the piece I was hoping you would share because I knew that you wove that in, and I think it's really important. The other thing I do, kind of depending on the learner, but often, is I will specifically name the areas that I like that the family wants goals to cover. So I won't necessarily like put sample goals in a parent input statement, that I do separately, but I will say we want, academic goals to support fill in the blank areas, right? We want goals that support executive functioning. We want goals that support communication in XYZ ways, right? I used to, like, it's evolved over time with
Right.
everything, right? There's times I'll link free resources, right? I've linked Autism Level Up more times than I can count because they've got a lot of stuff that's not behind a paywall. So it's accessible to school districts, right? They can't say, oh, well, we can't afford that in our budget. It's like, well, yes, you can, because there is no budget needed, right? I've linked the Meaningful Speech blog a
Mm-hmm.
number of
Same.
times, right? For folks that are trying to understand what natural language acquisition, the stages of natural language acquisition and Gestalt language processing. Um, but I really like, I've learned from you the importance of lifting up what families are doing at home, because I think I had a little bit of a blind spot that schools might really be thinking, why are you dumping all this stuff on us? What are you doing? And I do think that that dynamic happens, right? Whether it's just a narrative or if it happens in real life, probably a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think that the opposite is true. I think there's times where families feel like they're just contorting themselves a million different directions and they need the school to deliver FAPE, the free and appropriate public education. And there is a balance there. And there should be collegiality between the family and the school team, right? Where it's like, this is what we're doing at home, opening the doors to those kinds of conversations between private providers and the school team. And that can be done a number of different ways, right? There's sometimes a cautionary tale that goes with that. And there's sometimes that folks feel really uncomfortable with it, but you can set parameters, right? I'd really like you to be able to talk to my child's private speech language pathologist, but I would really like to be present for whatever conversations that you have. And so when you sign the release of information, you really specify that you need to be present during those conversations. And you can frame it as, if you're feeling a little funny about saying, I don't trust y'all to talk about my kid behind my back.
Which I've had parents say that blatantly in the meeting.
Well, fair enough, right? Some people might be more comfortable using that kind of full transparency. Others might be more comfortable, and this probably has a hint of truth to it also, of, I'm learning, so I want to be part of the conversation so I can continue my learning. And I want to know really kind of what you're doing individually and how you're sort of coming together and supporting similar things so that I can be carrying that on at home as well, right? Like you can kill multiple birds with one stone.
Right. Well, also
So,
it's in how it's like you're playing telephone, right? So it's like sometimes,
right,
you want to be a part of that conversation so that you can make sure what your private provider is relaying to the school provider and what the school provider is relaying to the private provider is actually what you've expressed, right?
right,
Is actually the concerns you've expressed or the things that you've expressed that you've seen that have been supportive. And so instead of, them not having, so to speak, the middleman in that discussion, you're right there able to confirm or deny or restate or adjust what's being said. Um, but I think too, when we really talk about the importance of parent input in a neuroaffirming way, I think the core tenets of that is that you're making sure that the whole learner is represented. And so when we are doing that procedural checklist, tell me about your learner. I've had a number this school year of parents who have actually been sent like electronic forms to fill out, where it's like, what are your child's strengths? Like, what are their challenges? What do you want them to accomplish this year? Is there any other information you want to share? Like all these like great questions. And
right.
then when we take that a step further with that neural affirming piece, on the parent side, again, it's thinking about what Lisa and I mentioned is that, like, are you mentioning how they communicate? And a big thing that I do is how do they communicate when regulated versus dysregulated?
Yes.
Because my oldest son is very verbal. I am very verbal. We use speaking as our main form of communication. When we are dysregulated, we shut down and we are no longer speaking. And so there have been different approaches, whether it's drawing, writing, using text and an electronic device, using gestures. So I do this thing and I've shared it, and it's been apparently very effective because I've heard it multiple times. I give this example where I'm like, one, are you mad at yourself? Two, are you mad at the situation? Three, are you mad at both? And that has really moved the conversation along without forcing him to speak in the moment. And so the neuroaffirming piece is making sure you're recognizing the communication, the regulation, the executive functioning, the sensory needs, the motor needs. Like you're asking this, you're incorporating this, you're acknowledging what that looks like, regulated and dysregulated, where the barriers are and the strengths, that all of that being addressed is really to me what makes a parent statement neuroaffirming. And then from the school staff side, it's asking those questions. Hey, mom, you mentioned that Destiny struggles with math. This is real life, guys. I've always struggled in math. It's like, so what does it look like? And Lisa's a math teacher. So that's the irony here. And so it's like Destiny's always struggled in math. And it's like, so what does that look like for Destiny? How does she communicate that she's struggling? Does she communicate that she's struggling? Or does she just shut down? Which is its own form of communication in a different way, right? But one thing I want to preference, because I know Lisa has something she wants to add to this. Now I feel like kind of rant I'm going on. One thing I want to reference is that I no longer say that behavior is a form of communication,
Mm.
because in the disability space, I listen to disabled individuals, and they have mentioned that if they are having an involuntary movement, like they are not trying to communicate something, right? It's just a spasm or it's just an involuntary movement that they cannot control, and there's no communication connected to that. So when I talk about behavior, I don't say behavior is communication. I say get curious about what is behind the behavior. And I say get curious about what the unmet need is in the area that they need support. And that should be in the parent input, which then guides where we go with present levels and the remainder of the IEP document.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I exclamation point, ding, 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 all the things going back to earlier episodes. Yeah, no, it was Neuroclastic a couple of years ago, put together like a series of posts about the statement, all behavior is communication, being at best misleading. and they really went into some detail about it, and I really paused and thought, oh, I need to learn. I've got some learning to do here, right? And I think a lot of behavior is trying to communicate something, but it's not all. And it was just a reminder, whether it's we're talking about behavior or just in general, binary statements are not typically a safe place to go, right? Because we don't capture the nuance, Destiny.
Yeah.
But yeah, no,
In
I
case
mean,
you're
one of the
wondering,
things, oh, go ahead, what?
in case you're wondering, being neuroaffirming is not binary.
Oh gosh, no. Yeah, no, absolutely not. No, one of the things I think is really important to touch on in this episode too is the timing of
Mhm.
when parent input is provided, right? So for me, like I said, sort of drawing back on my own experience of sitting in a room going, if one more person asks me what my daughter's strengths are, I'm gonna lose my marbles, right? It's if we want this parent input to shift the direction of goals or shift how folks are thinking about accommodations or shifting just their own thinking about my child,
Mhm.
what gives them enough time for that sort of thought process to translate into action? And what I typically strive for, it's not always possible, but I really like to provide parent input at least a week ahead of an IEP meeting.
100%. I like to provide any letter or anything at least a week ahead of time. And I this is not a knock to my clients. Some of my families, sometimes it doesn't happen, right? Because
Right.
it doesn't, they're the ones providing it and it doesn't get to them to the day before. And I always acknowledge in the meeting, like, hey, you may not have had the opportunity to read this, but this is what it is. But yeah, I'm a big proponent of being open and transparent because I always say I don't want my time wasted.
Right.
So when we get in a meeting, you know what we're here for, you know what we're asking, you know what we're requesting, you know what we're talking about, you know our concerns. You know the things that have gone really well because I put it in there. And so we should have some direction to this. And where that can get complicated um, is when it's not a parent requested IEP meeting, right? I always tell my families sometimes what we have to do is really shape and taper our expectations while also setting a boundary. And what I mean by that is if it's an annual IEP meeting, they have boxes, and I tell my parents this legally that they have to check, right? They are things that they have to do. But one of the things I say is like if the parent is bringing something to the table that they feel like is very important and hasn't been discussed, and they're like, oh, we don't have time to discuss that because that happens. They'll say that. I'm like, so then would you like to set up another meeting to discuss it? Because my point is that's the boundary of like, we're going to discuss this, but we don't have to discuss it now, but we're going to discuss it. And so, but I think that leans to a really great, well done parent input statement because when we're doing those parent input statements, that is often, right, reflective of where you're at that moment. It's reflective of what has been going well, what hasn't been going well, what am I concerned about, what is the whole picture of my learner. And I like to tell my parents that once you get that parent input statement, that's what we go back to. So when it's like, we didn't know that Destiny struggled with transition, but you did because I put it in my parent input statement. We
Right.
didn't know that Lisa
Like,
struggles with subs, but you did because I put it in my parent input statement, right? And so
right.
that's what I feel like that parent input statement too. Again, we go back to that, checkbox accountability piece for me. Um, just similar to what you're doing, it's a callback to if you really read this statement. And I've had some meetings where they're straight up like, can you read us the statement? Right? Because they want to make sure everyone hears it. Um, but that's a way for, and I've had some parents who've asked, could they read it? But either way, it is a way to call back to and say, I told you this was a trigger. I told you this was a strength. I told you this was a support. I told you this was a barrier. And it's right there in black and white where everyone can see it.
That is correct. Yeah, I actually had a really, I think, powerful moment for a family recently where I don't know that it was a formal parent input statement as much as it was just it might have just been an email, and we can talk about sort of the difference of where things kind of could go or should go. I'm using air quotes. But the family had communicated in writing ahead of the start of school year um, that they're not yet independent with toileting learner um, was not really ready at all to be placed like in a bathroom, right? That was a real stress and trigger. And for the time being, to please not try, like, don't change the diaper, call if there's, a need for a change, and please do not take our child into the bathroom. It causes a tremendous amount of stress. And I don't know what happened, but on day 2, some poor para took the learner into the bathroom, placed them on the toilet, thought, oh, the diaper wasn't soiled, but I'll put a new one on, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to be kind. In their brain, it was no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Child totally dissociates, goes home in a new diaper. The diapers that were in the bag were gone. And the family was left with, like, what the hell happened to our kid? And the kid was so shut down, they weren't able to communicate at all what had happened. And so this family spent an entire weekend wondering if something really inappropriate had happened or not, which was terrifying. And so we ended up having a meeting recently, and because I'm there, the program specialist was there. Anyway, I told the family straight up, there needs to be repair, because since this incident has happened, the learner has really struggled with school refusal. Right? I hope everybody was sitting for that shocking information, that this young person doesn't feel that the school environment is safe, and so the anxiety is so high, they've really struggled to go. And the father said, there needs to be some level of repair. And without blinking an eyelash, they said, absolutely, there will be. And they owned that they hadn't communicated properly with the para. There certainly wasn't malintent, but hiccups happen and repair has to happen. And so we discussed what repair would look like, and what would be resonant for the learner. And it was written down and documented, and they even scheduled when it was going to happen. So it really is important that you've documented, because this family could say, hey, we notified you in writing, and something went sideways where it wasn't communicated to everyone. And they were incredibly gracious. They said, we don't think that there was malintent, but it was like, you traumatized our kid.
Right. No. And that's the piece that it's always about. And I'm not going to go off on a tangent when I say this, but in my head, I'm going off on a tangent. It's always interesting to me that disabled learners are considered the traumatizers.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not considered enough that they are the traumatized.
That is correct.
And that if you weren't traumatizing them, then no one else would be traumatized.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, that's to me the beauty of a parent input statement when done in a neuroaffirming way and when done right, is that you give this picture of this amazing learner who is going into a place that wasn't created for them, wasn't created with them in mind, and trying to adapt it so that it can be a place that they can feel safe and comfortable and learn. And notice how I said safe and comfortable before I said learn.
That is correct.
And because what also gets left out too is that I have so many families, I'm sure you've seen this too, Lisa, where the parents have figured out early on that they need some type of non-traditional schooling, or public or private or charter wasn't working. And so they did, homeschooling or unschooling, different types of things throughout their elementary years. And then the learner gets to middle school and is like, I want to go to school with my friends. I want to go to school with my community that I live in and I've built around and that I've seen and played with and gone to birthday parties with. And then the parent is trying to figure out, how do I make this setting that is not comfortable for them comfortable? And it's because, they're wanting to go, because I do hear a lot about, like, why would you make your child go somewhere they don't want to go? And it's like, it's not that simple. That comes from a place of privilege when you say things like that, because not everyone cannot have their child go to public
Correct.
school. Everyone could keep their child home and homeschool and work and have that balance and that capacity. But the parent input statement, I think, really allows for you to then that leaves me with one other thing. I was gonna like head towards wrapping it up, but one thing I forgot to say during this episode that I think is so important too is that being mindful of how you talk about your child. Because as parents, we have a tendency to see certain things at home. And then when those things are displayed in school, and they mention them to us, we might be like, oh, yeah, they do that, or like in heavy agreement. Always be mindful of the context, right?
Yeah.
Because that can get flipped. And you could be coming from a place of like, ha ha ha, my kid does that like every other 5-year-old. And the school is coming from a compliance standpoint and a compliance view
Correct.
and a safety view. And they're like, yeah, that's really not appropriate. That's really not safe. That's really concerning. We need to seclude. Like, and so I always find, yeah, so I always
Mm.
find myself telling my parents, sometimes the way in which you communicate about your child can impact and influence how the school perceives them. So be very mindful when you are communicating. And for any school staff, administrators, educators out there listening, I'm not telling them not to be honest. So shut the fuck up. What I'm saying is be honest, but also ask for context, because sometimes it is switching to neuroaffirming is hard. It's difficult. It's not easy. And people are like, what do you mean? Like, view everyone as human? No, I'm talking about the language you use. And so
Right.
sometimes we don't always have the neuroaffirming language to refer to something occurring. And so it's sometimes about you're spending time educating and reframing for them to say yes, no. And I had that happen in a meeting last school year where the teachers were saying what they were saying. And then I said, well, I don't think that, it was coming from a place of ill intent. And the teacher literally saw me and she said, 100%. I think that she was anxious. And then everyone around the table, though, had never challenged, so to speak, the statement before. So when the
Sure.
teacher said that, everyone was like, wait. And the teacher's like, I 100% believe it was coming out of a place of anxiety. I 100% believe that she was nervous about this. And then that put her on edge. But that was the first time that that was brought to the forefront. And we could really look at how
Right.
do we support this anxiety and not how do we extinguish this behavior.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. Right. I mean, Jessica Hanzo and I talk about this a lot in our PDA course and in some of the presentation type stuff we've done since, where it's like shifting that mindset from willful control
Mm-hmm.
over behavior to really understanding stress response
Yes.
and reframing that the child isn't giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time, right? So, what are the ways that we can accommodate this young person in this moment of stress and take our ego out of it, not about us?
Mm-hmm.
So what do we need to do to take care of ourselves to stay regulated? Because that's what this young person needs.
Mm-hmm.
And how can I show up for them in a way that de-escalates the situation and returns them to a sense of felt safety?
Bing, 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 bing.
Yeah, I mean, cognizant of time and not wanting to have a 3-hour episode.
Right.
I think we've talked fairly in depth about what a formal parent input statement can look like. I do want to lift up that there's other types of communication that could be considered parent input.
Right.
You know, and sort of a brief overview of where I think certain things kind of belong. You know, I think that email can be a great way to communicate ahead of an IEP meeting. You know, not everything has to be formal, and an email is, you know, sort of date stamped and captured. And when I say formal, it's like, you know, date to, from, regarding, CC to file kind of letter. Whereas an email is typically, in my brain, like less formal. But I do think that, you know, requests for drafts, requests for the agenda and the notice of meeting.
Right.
If you have a couple of items, like kind of back to your example of it being an annual IEP, but the family has some concerns they want to lift up, or they've got questions and they want to make requests, right? That can be done in an email.
Right.
If there's been a whole heap of stuff happening and you're calling a meeting, you might want to outline the heap of mess in a formal letter of concern. And typically in that, I like to sort of outline sort of either like the overarching themes, or like a brief bulleted like timeline of events. And then I like to include sort of remedies being sought. You know, so whether that's a new goal being added, whether that's an assessment being done, whether it's a, you know, change of plan, whatever it is. And then in that, a statement of if these requests are going to be denied, you know, that denial needs to be provided via a PWN, prior written notice, with all the data and rationale included for the denial. Because certain states are really, really good about providing prior written notices, and others are not. So, not to throw California under the bus, but California, generally speaking, is not as likely to send a PWN, whereas, you know, Texas, Iowa, I think in Georgia, Florida, they're not going to do anything. Tennessee, Colorado, they're not going to do anything without sending a prior written notice along with the IEP. But in California, the prior written notice doesn't come with the IEP typically. So that's something to know.
And you have to check the prior written notice. So don't just because you get one doesn't mean you just go, yep, I got one. They check the box and says no, read that bad boy. And I can't remember what state it is, because me and Lisa support a lot of states, but there's one state where their notes actually count as the prior written notice. So that's interesting.
Oh, there you go. That's very interesting.
And so then you have to then check the notes, right? Because you got to make sure it's really reflective of what you're saying, because that is what they're going to go back to. And as you were talking, I was thinking, like, didn't we do? And we did. So if you're hearing this episode at this point, we did do a document episode.
We did do a documentation episode, but we recorded it several weeks ago, so I can't remember all the things that we talked about.
Like, I was thinking
that episode.
Yes, like if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely go back to it.
Yeah, definitely go back. And you're right. And you said something that tripped my brain, and now it's gone. Oh gosh. Oh, it came back. About the notes. So there are some districts, some states that are really, really, really good about saving time at the end of a meeting to review the meeting notes to make sure that everyone is comfortable with the capture. And there are others that don't do that. And it's such good practice. Like, it's a really good practice to save some time for the end of the meeting to read through the notes, because it gives you the opportunity to say, that didn't really capture what I said, or wait, didn't we also discuss, right? So that's one thing. The last thing I want to say about parent input is, yes, you as the parent or caregiver can provide input about goals.
Yeah, 100%. And I just did that like scoff voice that you all heard because no, there is a lot where parents are just not informed to be, enough to know that they can. And they're also told when they try to give input that they can't. And then there's also that discussion on data where they then turn around and they'll try and say we have to have the data to make the goal, which you do have to have data, but there are different types of data. And I'm not going to go down that hole at this point in time, but I'm sure we will get to it because I know we should do an entire episode on goals.
Yeah, and data collection and everything. And the other thing too is you can also provide input about accommodations. You can provide input about anything. But I think that
needs.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, 100%.
So before we go off on many tangents, as you can see, we are very passionate about neuroaffirming IEPs. And you can see it's at this point, I feel like woven into our DNA because it triggers so many thoughts and things when we're thinking about it. When it comes to a neuroaffirming parent input statement, make sure that you are capturing the whole learner. Make sure that you are incorporating their communication needs, their regulation needs, their sensory needs, their motor needs, and their executive functioning needs. Make sure you are including what it looks like what those things look like when they're regulated versus dysregulated. Make sure you're incorporating, some successes from the prior year. Make sure you're looking at some barriers or hurdles from the prior year. Make sure you're including what it is that you want them to accomplish for the upcoming year or over the course of elementary, middle, high school, over the course of this IEP document and their educational journey. Try as much as you can to get it to the school team, in a reasonable time that allows them to really read it, digest it in case that they have questions. If you're the school team listening, get it, read it, ask questions, try and learn more, mention where you're seeing things that may work at home that the parent is saying that you're seeing that don't work there, because that can shape the accommodations and the goals. But really at the end of the day, make sure that your voice and should your learner be old enough to engage and ask questions and give their insight and input, their voice is being heard when you're completing these parent input statements.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't have wrapped it up better myself.
Well, thank you guys for listening, and we will catch you on the next episode of Affirming Village Podcast. Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Baskin Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.